Good morning from Washington, D.C. My name is Dr. Anwar Bukhars, and I am a professor of counterterrorism and countering violent extremism at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies. I want to extend a very warm welcome to the many Africa Center alumni, distinguished colleagues, and friends who have joined us today for this webinar on disengaging violent extremists. We're pleased to partner with the African Center for the Study and Research on Terrorism at CAIR for this event. And now I would like to pass it over to our director, the director of the Africa Center, Kate Enquist-Knopf. Kate?
Well, thank you, Anwar, and just allow me please to add my welcome to all of the Africa Center's alumni and friends and colleagues. As Anwar says, we're so pleased to once again be partnering with the African Center for the Study and Research on Terrorism, and warm greetings to our colleagues at CAIR as well. As many of you know, the Africa Center serves as a forum for research, for academic programs, and the exchange of ideas with the aim of enhancing citizen security by strengthening the effectiveness and accountability of African institutions. We are Department of Defense Regional Center located at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. And we carry out our mission of advancing African security by expanding understanding, providing a trusted platform for dialogue, building enduring partnerships, and catalyzing strategic solutions. Accordingly, we seek to generate relevant insight and analysis that informs practitioners and policymakers on topical and emerging security trends and on effective responses to dynamic and complex security challenges. And recognizing that addressing these serious challenges can only come about through candid and thoughtful exchanges, the Africa Center provides opportunities such as our program today for partners to exchange views on interests and sound practices. And by engaging with all our partners, military and civilian, governmental and civil society, national and regional, we hope to reinforce that we all have valuable roles to play in mitigating the complex drivers of conflict and insecurity on the continent today through enduring and capable institutions. This kind of dialogue, we believe, infused with real world experiences and fresh analysis, such as we'll hear today from our wonderful panel, we hope provides an opportunity for continued learning and catalyzes concrete actions. So thank you once again to all in our audience for joining us today for this conversation on disengaging violent extremism. We are looking forward to hearing from our panel and to having the opportunity to hear from all of you through the questions and comments on the chat line. Thank you once again. Back to you, Anwar.
Thank you, Kate. And now let's begin our session. I mean, we have two distinguished panelists today that will help us explore the latest research related to the effectiveness of interventions aimed at disengaging violent extremists, particularly in conflict-affected settings. And the conversation with the panelists, provides us an opportunity to fill in the knowledge gaps as well as to strengthen this emerging evidence base about what works and what does not in facilitating the disengagement of members of violent extremist groups. I mean, violent extremist groups, as we know, unfortunately keep evolving, but the responses to them have not kept pace. There are still significant knowledge gaps about the conditions that support or hinder, for example, disengagement from violent extremism. Disengagement is the process, as you will hear today, by which individuals, they cease to be mobilized in support of violent extremist movements. And as recent reports by the Crisis Group and by the Institute for Security Studies show, there are a number of reasons why individuals disengage from violent extremist groups, including in the case of, as we will hear today, Boko Haram. The research shows, the Crisis Group research, the Institute for Security Studies research show that some individuals, they join willingly, inspired by the group's religious rhetoric or narrative on state neglect, and others, they do it for socioeconomic opportunities. Others were conscripted or abducted and held captive in Boko Haram strongholds. So there is a diversity of who joins these groups. Now, as we have, thousands of men and women that were formerly affiliated with violent extremist organizations, they are returning home, or they are returning to areas under governmental control. So it's critical to develop, a deeper understanding of the various steps, right, on the journey from disengagement to rehabilitation. In the Lake Chad Basin countries, for example, I mean, the fact that we have thousands of individuals associated with or kidnapped by Boko Haram are deserting, as the crisis group put it in its report, and ISS also put it, is an advantage, right, for these countries in their efforts to contain this problem and to stabilize it. But desertions, they need to be effectively managed. So, as the ISS report put it, the way in which, ex-Boko Haram associates, for example, are received and screening must be predictable, and it must be based on standard reception, screening, profiling mechanisms. So there's also a growing sense of urgency for affected countries, to develop and implement rehabilitation and reintegration policies and programs. And as we will hear, rehabilitation and reintegration initiatives, they come in different forms, in different shapes, in different sizes. So the settings where the interventions are conducted, they shape the nature and structure of these programs. Programs carried out in prison settings, for example, necessitates, different types of interventions than ones that are implemented in non-custodial settings, where the targets of rehabilitation and reintegration have associations with violent extremist groups, but are not serving prison sentences. The risk status of the targets of interventions also play a role in developing and operationalizing rehabilitation and integration programs. So, depending on the context and also the capacity of the intervention providers, rehabilitation and reintegration programs, can range from largely single type of interventions, say theological or ideological, to comprehensive ones that include different types of support, material, psychosocial, recreational, cultural, etc. But there is no one-size-fits-all approach, obviously, to disengagement, rehabilitation, and reintegration. But nonetheless, there are common principles that should guide these initiatives. And we are fortunate today to have two distinguished panelists to share, lessons with us about what is known about the effectiveness of countering violent extremism intervention, targeting reintegration aimed at disengaging violent extremists. The two panelists will help us add value to the broader comprehension of this problem and to this process of leaving, from leaving violent extremist organizations to rehabilitation and reintegration. So the first speaker is Ms. Martine Zuthen. We're fortunate to have her with us here. She's an associate fellow in the Terrorism and Conflict Program at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, and she's currently based in Kenya. And she set up the RUSI's operation in East Africa. She focuses on extremism, radicalization, or countering violent extremism, and on research methodology. And Martine is currently working on CVE, countering violent extremism, research projects globally and in the Horn of Africa, particularly, including leading one strand of a systematic literature review focusing on rehabilitation. Martine is also leading the monitoring and evaluation and research supporting the disengagement program in Somalia. Mr. Namdi Obasi is Crisis Group's distinguished Nigeria senior advisor, where he leads research, policy prescriptions, and advocacy in Nigeria. He's widely published. He has authored 2 books, Ethnic Militias, Vigilantes, and Separatist Groups in Nigeria in 2002, Small Arms Proliferation and Disarmament in West Africa in 2002. He also contributed to several books and peer-reviewed publications on conflicts, violent extremism and organized crime in West Africa. He's frequently interviewed by Nigerian and international media, and regularly consulted by international organizations working on Nigeria. And now I'll turn to our panelists, and I'll start with Martine. She recently authored an excellent literature review of the effectiveness of counterterrorism and preventing and countering violent extremism activities aimed at disengagement from violent extremism. So I ask all of you really to read the piece, and it's on our website. So Martine, what evidence is there on what works in disengagement and rehabilitation of violent extremists?
Great. Yeah, allow me just first to say thank you so much for having me. It's great to be back with you all, and I'm proud to be speaking with such a distinguished colleague as well. Yeah, as you mentioned, what I'm going to talk about today is, of course, my work on reviewing the literature in this area, as well as this systematic literature review I did with colleagues from RUSI around what works in disengagement. And all of this is published. So, you know, as you were saying, if anyone's interested, I'll send you the link so you can download the reports. But partly to answer your question, at least to start, that, you know, the evidence is not so deep. So I thought I would also bring in some examples from some of the work that I'm doing in Somalia on a disengagement program there, whenever I need to complement with some examples. So in terms of what works, the key question is, like, what is the what? Like, what are we talking about that should be working? What is it that we think that the program should be offering? What is the change we are looking at? And very often when you review the literature, the programs and the evaluations are not very clear on this, which makes it quite difficult to kind of compare and to suggest what might be working, because we are comparing apples and oranges and the literature is not so strong. I think a key distinction to make is, as you're saying, you know, there's one group of literature that deals with program that focuses on disengagement, where rehabilitation and reintegration is a key part of that. And then there's other programs that are more formulated in the language around de-radicalization. And here the key aspect is to look at how central is ideology in the focus on the programs. Because the types of activities that programs that are very de-radicalization focused, they would focus a lot on how to change the individual's beliefs. So they would have a lot of religious education, a lot of value-based components into their interventions. Whereas the ones that are a little bit more, can I call it socioeconomic focus, they have greater emphasis on general education. You're learning to read and write, vocational training, job creation, social skills, and so on. And I think the assumption behind those is that individuals change when they engage with other people and when they become responsible. So the change that we are looking for in these different types of programs influence, you know, what we are looking at in terms of what we hope to be working. And what is really weak in the literature is a clear articulation of what the programs are trying to achieve. So therefore that question is really hard to answer. I think broadly it's fair to say that programs that are managed by Muslim majority countries, in particular in the Middle East, so for example the Saudi programs, the Yemeni programs, probably also some in Southeast Asia, they are more focused on ideology, and they focus very much on changing the beliefs of the individuals who've been with violent extremist groups towards a state-sanctioned interpretation of the religious text. So they have a very specific goal that they are looking for, whereas many other of the programs have not looked at the programs itself, but the literature on the programs, for example, from most of sub-Saharan Africa, they are less specific about this is the change, ideological change we are looking for. They're more focused on the reintegration part. Previously in the literature, the way that success was measured was very often around what is called recidivism. So, you know, it was considered a failure if an individual who had gone through a program ended up going back to the groups. But in the literature, it's now being challenged that, first of all, you can't go back to the groups for other reasons than the failure of the programs. There might be other factors influencing that you end up going back. You might live in areas they control or whatever. So they are suggesting we need also to find other measures of success, really, rather than only recidivism. We need to look at how do they reintegrate? Do they get involved in politics or political conversation? What are their social skills? What are their social links? How do they change their attitude? So in the literature, there's a conversation and has been over the last 5 years around, what does success look like? And it's still very much kind of evolving, I would say. And then there's also a recognition that previously most programs focused on men who had gone into violent extremist groups, and most countries have one approach to high-level members that needs to be dealt with by the justice system, and then they have lower-level members where there's an opportunity for forgiveness and rehabilitation. But there was very little consideration on rank that they've played, on gender. So now it's coming out clearly that not, as you were saying before, not one size fits all, but what is effective and what works for one type of the population is not sure that it will work for another. So female competence, for example, might need another engagement for them to be able to reintegrate successfully, and so on. So, what is it that works for who and under what circumstances is really what we need to start answering. And here, another aspect is also to recognize that resources matters a lot. Like, for example, in Saudi Arabia, the state provides really good rehabilitation facilities. They give grants to the guys when they want to go to the home to their families. They help them with jobs, and it's provided for by the state. Whereas at least the work that I'm doing in Somalia, and I'm sure perhaps also in Nigeria, the state is less committed to funding these programs, and very often external donors come in and play a role. So at least for us in Somalia, we have to think about how many can we afford to rehabilitate? How long can the programs be? How extensive are they? And of course, that also influence kind of what works, what resources do we have available? And another thing, in my remarks, I'm limited by what is there in the evidence. So the countries that have programs that made it through our review are from Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Somalia, Nigeria, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Singapore, and then a number of programs from the global north or from Europe, but I think they are less relevant in this context. There's loads of countries that have programs, I'm presuming, like I know Sudan has, I'm sure Egypt must have, Kenya certainly have, but there's no evaluations, there's no evidence available. So there might be a lot of information about what works, but we don't have it in the public space. So as researchers, we can't digest it and review it. And I totally understand it's because it's very sensitive. The programs are run by government. It's considered difficult to share, but the literature is evolving and more programs are opening up. So yeah, let me finish on that point. Really like advocating for the need of us. If we want to know what works, we need to publish more, and we need to learn more from more programs to really build the evidence base. Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say on what works.
So thank you, Martine. I mean, as you said, it's evident that the field is still emerging, and we still need more, as you put it in that piece you published, to develop greater, conceptual clarity, and this impacts success, what success looks like. So you're right. I mean, does success mean, leaving the groups? Does it mean, as you said, social, economic, or political reintegration? Does it mean, as you stated, changing the behavior and ideology of violent extremist groups? Does it mean advocating against the group? So all of this are essential. You're right, for understanding the effectiveness of these programs, and context matter. So now let's go to the second question. Bear in mind again that this is still an emerging field, right? So what evidence is there on what does not work in disengagement and rehabilitation of violent extremists?
Yeah, I was thinking about that question as I was preparing, and in a way I can be very quick. We don't know. We don't know what doesn't work because we are not measuring it. And that's just simply because of evaluation. It's very difficult to robustly document what doesn't work. Of course, practitioners all over the world have a very good idea about what doesn't work, but in the literature, it doesn't really stand out. One thing though that I did pick out from one study was the argument that if programs are not built on a whole of society approach, they are less likely to be effective. And I was thinking through this, meaning, that you need the different line ministries to work together, like Ministry of Health, Ministry of Security, Ministry of Religious Affairs, Ministry of Education. And here I thought it's not in the literature, but from our work in Somalia, the guys we work with, they are given opportunities to do vocational training, and one of the very popular courses are mechanics. And if we don't work as a center well with Ministry of Education, they can't get a certificate. And if they don't get a certificate, once they leave the centers, people will not trust that they have the skills required to be able to be a mechanic, or they can't go into further studies or build on what they've learned, and it's really difficult to them to get a job. So just as an example, because these processes are so complex and tie into so many aspects of life that it does seem quite possible that if you don't have a whole of government approach, you're much less likely to be successful. And I think tying into that, and I didn't say that before, but what we know that works is that these processes are very complex, and when people change, it doesn't happen overnight. So you need lots of different small intervention, socially, economically, educational, and that is what changes an individual to be able to reintegrate in society eventually. So what can I say, like the programs that have most diverse components and are recognizing the need for the different elements for each individual are the ones that are most likely to be successful. So therefore, what doesn't work is when a program is trying to isolate or just do one activity, for example, just one education program or one job training course, that are much less, like, it's obvious, but that is much less likely to be effective than to try and have a combination of engagement, education, job, reconnection with families, social skills, and all of this. So, what works is the most comprehensive and the most complex approaches. And of course, that's difficult and expensive, but that is what works. And then maybe just to bring out, there's also more literature about what doesn't work and what works from, for example, the gang literature. So sometimes when we're thinking about doing programs in this area, there are related fields. Okay, yes, gang literature doesn't deal with the ideological component, but there's still a lot of social dynamics and group dynamics and the process of leaving a criminal past that could be used in this area. So it's just to encourage that if we are thinking about starting new programs and new approaches, we can learn from other fields, even though if we don't have the robust evidence to start with. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Martine. The necessity of learning from other fields is critical. And as you said, the approaches which are seemingly most effective are those that are undertaken in contexts where the state plays a more holistic role, right, across different intervention areas. So we need these integrated approaches. I mean, in the literature, there's some criticism towards some programs, those that you mentioned in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, in which there is an overemphasis on religion and ideology. This emphasis on religion ideology plays a much greater role in the programmatic response to violent extremism in general than I think the research indicates it should. But again, point well taken. It has to be all, it has to be holistic. And that takes us to the third question, is which is linked, obviously. I mean, what conditions promote or hinder success in disengagement and rehabilitation of violent extremists?
Yeah. And here I thought three things really that I wanted to highlight. I mean, context is everything. So the policy context that frames the opportunities for the defectors are key. And I'll go into it in a bit more detail. And then there are links to their families, and then finally community acceptance. So in terms of how success come about yeah, those are some of the key elements, and I think Somalia is a really stark example of that, where I think roughly 5 years ago the presidential amnesty was announced that kind of set an atmosphere of forgiveness and willingness to recognize that some of these guys would have a future outside Shabab. And even now, when we interview the guys who are coming into the center in Mogadishu, they say, not all of them, but a large proportion of them mentioned that what made them leave was the presidential announcements. They felt that if they, it's really dangerous, they put their life at risk, but if they manage to either, surrender if AMISOM troops are in the area, or if they manage to escape and survive that process, they know that there's a future for them. They know that there will be a process where they will be having opportunities to be accepted back, and that gives them the confidence to do it. So having a policy framework such as an amnesty, it can be other ways, but like something that sets out the scene that these guys know that there's a future for them is really critical. I think in particular in a context where armed conflict is ongoing. The second one is linked to families. And again, from our work in Somalia, we can see that those who reintegrate the fastest are the ones who, even while they're at the center, they establish links to their families. They have family visits, not right now because of COVID and the political situation, but under normal circumstances, they are able to go on weekend leave once a month. They are able to have family visit. They're able to have phone contact. And the earlier that contact is made, the more likely the process is to succeed. Because in Somalia, social reintegration and economic reintegration go hand in hand, because it's through your clan you'll get your job, in particular in the remote areas, right? It's through your clan that you'll get your job. It's through your clan that you'll be protected. It's through your clan that opportunities will come, and you'll be able to, for example, meet a spouse and so on. So the family connection is a really critical condition, at least in that context. And then finally, the community acceptance. And here again, the policy framework plays a huge role. So the fact that there's an amnesty gives the community a confidence. Okay, if there's an individual who come back and who has a declaration certificate from the government that he's a defector from our program, people know that this is because of the amnesty that was given, and it's safe for them to, for example, hire him or offer him a place to sleep or food or whatever it might be. They know that the government will not arrest them, and of course they fear retaliation from Shabab, but there's some kind of process that allows the communities to be more feel more safe in accepting these individuals back. So at least in my work in Somalia, those things are some of the key conditions for the success of the programs.
Excellent, thank you, Martin. Talking about that missing policy framework, you're right. The amnesty policy, it's worked pretty well in Algeria. A bit controversial, but it did deliver what was expected of it. And as you said, sometimes the missing policy framework, the sensitivity nature of rehabilitation here, but it's important in some contexts, that it promotes defection and disengagement. So the other element you mentioned, which is critical, and I'm sure Namdi will talk about it, is the importance of integrating, the recipient communities into these programs, because you need to encourage public buy-in. Very important here. Otherwise, there is a risk, obviously, of reoccurrence of violence. There's a risk of marginalization of these former combatants, and then driving them back into the fold, into the orbit of violent extremists. So we need more clarity on who the intervention is intended for, to be able to figure out what the effect is. In some cases, as you said, in Somalia, and it was highlighted by one of your colleagues, Khalil, in this study, Disengagement from Shabab, he highlights the importance of incentives, right, in trying to encourage violent extremists, obviously, to lead these groups. So careful consideration, just to sum up, and then I'll go to Namdi, must be included of how an intervention will prepare an individual for reintegration into the community, especially after they exit, these rehabilitation centers, and they exit prison, military internment camp. So we have to consider the individual needs from a pragmatic, as you said in your piece, and a dynamic perspective. And I think this links very well with what our second speaker, Namdi Obasi, will tackle. It's a particular case study here on Boko Haram. So Namdi, what are the main pathways to disengagement from Boko Haram, based on extensive research and work that you have done?
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thanks everyone on the audience. I would like to say, first of all, that there are two broad categories of disengagement that we're seeing in Nigeria. There are some that voluntarily disengage and exit the camps and the territories held by the violent extremist groups, but do not report to the government and do not submit to the government program. So they just disappear. We do not have statistics about them. The data is just not there. But we do know that a number of them have moved out of the Northeast. Some resettled in the central city of Kano. Some even went down to Lagos in the south, but just try to stay as low as possible. And the point is also because if they do identify themselves as former members of Boko Haram, they didn't exit through the government corridor. So they are seen as still potential risks, because it's not clear whether they have completely renounced the group, or whether they are still working as spies and informants in the wider society. So that category is completely under the radar, and we do not have clarity at all about it, but we know that it does happen. There is then, in the main, a government program, the Operation Safe Corridor, that tries to draw out members of the group. It targets low-level members and urges them to defect. And it does that by assuring them, messaging to them, communicating to them that they are safe if they come out and they won't be harmed, and so on. And it has drawn a number of good numbers since then. There is also a different program run by the Borno state government, but it's for women and children. It's a much smaller program. And there are other programs that, especially by the NIM Foundation, an NGO, that also does a program that is involved in rehabilitating former Boko Haram members. The government program has run since 2016. It was initiated in 2015, but officially launched in 2016. It's on the whole graduated about 800 and something members who were drawn out of the group. There's some concern that number is small relatively compared to the size of these groups. And while it does represent an effort to drain the membership of the groups, it may not have weakened the group any significantly. So we're still not clear about that. Secondly, it's a 24-week program that combines, de-radicalization and basic education, numeracy, and writing skills, as well as vocational training and so on. But all this being done within 24 weeks. Sometimes it's doubtful, whether it's equipping the graduates well enough for life outside. But the third issue I've also mentioned is that the program is focused on de-radicalization and rehabilitation. And it doesn't include the third leg of reintegration, The arrangement is that the graduates are handed over to the state government, in this case, the Borno state government, because Borno state has been the main theater of the violence. They're handed over to the Borno state government to then, undertake the reintegration with the communities. And so the program, as I said, doesn't cover the entire spectrum. And sometimes we lay a lot of emphasis on de-radicalization and on rehabilitation, but then the last leg of the process, the reintegration, is extremely crucial, and it's not clear that we've paid sufficient attention to that. Also because there is a lot of pushback from communities, given the scale of atrocities that the group has committed. There is, in very many communities, there's a very strong reluctance to have, these members back, however much they say they have repented or renounced the group. There's also a lot of opposition from other parts of the country that say, the government is pampering members of a violent group at the same time that it needs resources to concentrate on the victims in IDP camps and so on and so forth. And there hasn't been sufficient communication really about the benefit of this program and how it actually helps the overall efforts of countering the insurgency.
Okay, thank you. That takes us to the second question. If you can elaborate a bit on the various steps on the journey from disengagement to rehabilitation.
Well, the process starts by the military messaging to the members of the two groups, Boko Haram and ISWAP, messaging to them either by radio communication or by dropping leaflets from aircraft that inform them of the program, and then offer them that critical incentive that they would not be harmed if they come out voluntarily. And so they submit themselves, they surrender to the military operation, and they are taken to a detention center in Maiduguri, where they are where they are screened and profiled, and then split into different groups. Those that committed grievous atrocities, of course, would have to face a judicial process. Those who are lower level members, which are the ones that the Operation Safety Corridor is targeting, these are people who were sometimes conscripted. They were forced, sometimes their towns were overrun and they were just grabbed and included in the group. So they didn't really have a choice. And some of them would have left the group earlier on, if not that they were under threat of death. So they had to stay on until they could find a convenient exit. In other words, they are not seen as posing a major risk, but they need to be rehabilitated and eventually reintegrated into society. And then, of course, the third category are the women and children who are largely considered innocent and therefore taken to a different center, the Bulumkutu Center for Women and Children in Borno State. But the larger number are taken to the Operation Safe Corridor camp at Madam Sidi in Gombe State, also in the southeast. And then when they get to the camp, there is also, as I said, a range of activities that they are put through, both in terms of religious education or re-education, skill acquisition, basic learning skills, and so on. There is an argument that most of these people actually do not really need de-radicalization. They were probably not radicalized in the first place. They were, as I said, conscripted into a group, or they have already denounced the group and de-radicalized in a sense, before they came out. So what they really need is more of rehabilitation and reintegration rather than de-radicalization. But in any case, who knows? We can't tell exactly. So we put all of them through the same process. And then at the end of the process, before they graduate, they are also brought before a panel where they formally renounce the group and pledge loyalty to the country before they are finally accepted as, having been properly processed. And as I said, beyond that, then the Operation Safe Corridor hands them over to the state government, and then the state government bears responsibility for integrating them into communities. I think that's the whole chain of the process.
Okay, maybe we can touch on it later, because in that crisis group report that you helped obviously author, they talk about that brutal and tortuous path. I mean, from disengagement to rehabilitation, and it describes how the experience of getting from the point of defection to the camp you're talking about is often extraordinarily protracted. It's dangerous. There are poor detention conditions, and that threaten obviously to taint the program in a way that could obviously put funding at risk, especially donor funding. And the trouble begins from once they leave, right? As you mentioned, that these Boko Haram controlled territory, to turn themselves in. So as you were right, I mean, they're taken to these detention centers, often pressed for screening, but that's where the problems start. And that brings me to the to the third question is how do you strengthen a program like Nigeria's Operation Safe Corridor?
Well, as we highlighted in the report, there are at least 3 or 4 steps that we can take to strengthen the program. The first is we think that there's a need to step up messaging to the members of the group in the forests and in the territories that are held by the extremists, violent extremist groups. Clearly, we could reach more people, we could reach more members, we could communicate the message a little more strongly, and maybe that would encourage more defections out of the group. We also proposed about making the transit, from the point of the point where the defectors turning themselves over to the military to the arrival in the Operation Safe Corridor camp. That whole process, we could improve by reviewing it, the process of receiving them, of screening and profiling them, and separating between defectors and prisoners who were actually captured. In other words, they didn't submit to the military, they were captured. So the earlier they are separated, the better the processing will go. There were also concerns about improving the coordination between the Operation Safe Corridor and the state governments. People sometimes look back at Operation Safe Corridor and say it hasn't done enough about reintegration. It needs to be clear that this is not an Operation Safe Corridor, duty. It is a duty of the state government, but probably there's a need to better coordinate. The state governments need to do a lot more in trying to improve outreach to families, to communities, and preparing them for the return of their members. As I said earlier on, the atrocities committed by the group, are still very much in the memory of lots of people. And in fact, some of the atrocities are continuing. So you can imagine that there is considerable pushback to the notion of allowing them to come back to the communities. But at the same time, if they are not allowed to come back to the communities, then where else do they have to go? Some of them may eventually, have to return to where they feel, they will be welcome, which is going back to the forest. So it's a balance that we have to weigh, and then try to engage with communities and families to see how they can change their perception and be a little more welcoming to those who have come back from the Operation Safe Corridor camp. The other issue is about addressing the demand for justice. A lot of the pushback, a lot of the opposition to the disengagement program from the public, a lot of the criticism of Operation Safe Corridor is because people are also not seeing the more senior members of the group, the core members of the group who were captured as prisoners. We're not seeing them being tried, the prosecution and the conviction and the sanctions. That's not coming out clearly at all. So what comes out more clearly then is that the members of the group come back and then they are received by the government, and then they are pampered and trained, and at the end of the day they are let go. Unless people see that there is also a justice process going on by which the leaders, the higher officers of the groups are being sanctioned, it will be difficult to make this program more acceptable. In other words, we could improve the acceptability of the program by improving evidence that there's also a parallel process of justice which is being applied to the core members of the group who have been captured or who surrendered to the government.
Okay, thank you, Namdi. And that brings an end to this part of the conversation. I ask that the participants start typing their questions for the panelists into the Zoom chat, and then I will read your your questions to the panelists and to the audience. But you're absolutely right, Namdi. I mean, the creation of these programs, and that's what Martin said also, but in the case of Nigeria, this Operation Safe Corridor, was a welcome acknowledgement by the governments, right? That military response to these groups, in this case Boko Haram, is not enough to adequately, degrade this group. So Nigeria needs other tools. Yet the program, as you outlined in your remarks and also in that report, is appears to be far from reaching its potential. So the Nigerian authorities, they need to demonstrate that the program can guide these returnees, to graduation from this program, and then to reintegrate them back into the society safely and securely. So to do so, you need improved screening procedures, you need improvement in terms of detention safeguards, you need investments in reintegration, which you mentioned, and also critically, you need this public relations campaign, as you stated in your report, to try to win political support, because there's political opposition, but also to win public support, because that's what can make the program obviously appealing to potential defectors and also to those that fund it. So there needs to be more investment, as you stated, in the government needs to invest the resources and attention that the program requires, lest it fails. So let me just look at here the questions. All right, well, I have few here while waiting for my team to process the rest. Some of it is to Namdi, and they're asking you to comment on the reports of some of the graduates returning to Boko Haram after the program. So then what happens then? The Safe Corridor, another question, seems to be funded and managed by the military. And what is the actual level of expert involvement in the program? So that's another question here. Another question states, most programs tend to focus on the victims without serious consideration for society. And at the end, the society are not prepared to receive the victims, exactly what you said, when they eventually leave the center. So there needs to be more awareness on the part of society. How do you do that? So these are just the general questions that we have so far. So, Namdi or Martin can also jump in here. Oh yes, Namdi?
Yes, I think the first question is about members, graduates of the Safe Corridor program returning to Boko Haram. In the course of our work, and we actually spoke with a good number of the graduates of the program, as well as with the authorities of the state government and Operation Safe Corridor. There's only one case really that's very well known of one of the members who returned to the forest and went back to Boko Haram. And as we mentioned in the report, he also had to indicate that he was trying to leave. So it's not clear where he wants to belong. But if we have out of close to 900 and we have one relapse, then I think we are fairly good in saying that it's worked, or the program is working in terms of those who have passed through it. The other question is about the military running the program. Yes, it's military-led, but then it also has substantial support from UNICEF and from the International Red Cross. and a number of other non-governmental organizations, it does try to engage as much expertise as possible, both in terms of very knowledgeable clerics who come in to run the religious education programs, and technical hands who come in to deliver the vocational training. And that's why it's able to achieve, quite some bits within the 6 months, the 24 weeks span of the program. Most of the graduates that we spoke with seem to be very happy, really, with what the content of the program, especially the skills training aspect of it. So we think it's well run in that regard.
Martin, you want to add?
Yeah, just similarly in Somalia, the data we have from our program, and I fully recognize that that's a little bit biased in the sense that we only know what we know. We also don't have much evidence of guys going back to Shabab after having been through the programs. Some of those who are not comfortable going back to communities where Shabab is in control, they simply stay in Mogadishu and benefit from the clan mixes that are there. They can basically hide a little bit better. And that reminds me of what Namdi was mentioning in terms of a big group of defection happens through the government approved program in Somalia, whereas we run one of the centers. There's 4 others. But of course, there's also a big group that re-enters communities. And in Somalia, I would say it's not that it's completely hidden, but it's managed at a local level. It's the local police commander together with the clan leaders that make an agreement with that individual. And most likely it's because that person is not considered as dangerous or having as many atrocities so that it's possible to get them back. But you're very right that there's we don't know how big, but there's a group of people that simply reintegrate without a formal disengagement process.
Okay. Excellent. We have other questions here, and one is, what is the level of civil society, organization in disengagement, and for Martin, question is, some of those who have been rehabilitated in Somalia are, it states here, suspected to infiltrate the government offices. So what do you do about that? Another one is on DDR. I mean, how are the DDR programs addressing the drivers and or long-standing grievances that have motivated individuals to join these organizations in the first place? And here they're giving examples of human rights abuses perpetrated by the state, lack of accountability, feeling of marginalization, political exclusion, lack of access to public services, lack of economic opportunity, etc. So if these drivers and grievances are not addressed, then the question is, what will prevent those individuals who have been reinserted or reintegrated, provided that they are integrated into the community, from confronting these same issues again? So Martin, do you want to take any of these?
Yes, just quickly, the role of civil society in Somalia, for example, the programs that are for minors is run by UNICEF together with some civil society actors, and some of the programs are run by other UN agencies and ours. I don't know if you call that civil society, but it's international organizations that are supporting the government, and then they bring in local actors to help provide some of the services and the reintegration services after. If you know Somalia, you also know that the civil society doesn't really exist. So it's really hard sometimes to have providers of services in the civil society, but they are involved. I think in other contexts like Kenya, it would be possible to involve them in whole different ways because they have much better capacity. But they do have a role, and I think it's important to involve them where possible if the capacity is available. And to the question about infiltrating state, so just like what Nandi was explaining in terms of the process, when a defector either surrenders or basically runs away and comes into government control, they get to a center managed by the security services, and they are screened for 2 to 3 weeks. And in that process, it's assessed what role they've played and whether they are suitable for rehabilitation. And then they come to the centers, and the government is also present in the centers, and nobody is cleared for exit until they are cleared from the secret services. So they have enough opportunities to assess whether they consider this individual as safe to release, and a good number, or like a certain proportion of the guys that have gone through the process, they end up working for the army or the police or indeed other security organs. Of course, many other have other jobs, but the government spent a lot of effort to try and assess, to avoid exactly what you're saying. If there's 1 or 2 that are still with Amniat, which is what the intelligence wing is called, it's possible, but it's not something. It's not something that we have observed being dominant. Yeah.
Okay, Nandi, anything that you want to add here?
Yes, just to say that a number of civil society organizations are also involved in the process here. As I mentioned earlier on, the organization NEAM Foundation has what they call a Yellow Ribbon Initiative. It was launched in 2017. It targets mostly women, children, and youth that were associated with Boko Haram, and then does more of providing psychosocial support, behavioral and reintegration training, trauma support, moral instruction, peace mentoring, sports programs, and creative education programs. But then it's also on a small scale, but it does make some contribution. There are other organizations, civil society organizations, that are also involved in peace building processes and helping to build community acceptance for returnees, whether for the men passing through Operation Safe Corridor or the women coming back from the Bulunkutu Center. They organize outreach programs to the communities and community leaders to try and get them to accept the reintegration of the returning defectors. There are also organizations that have been involved in helping to carry out assessments and evaluations of the work of Operation Safe Corridor and to feed back into the program, which hopefully helps in refining, fine-tuning various aspects of it. So there's a lot of considerable civil society engagement at various entry points, and that is certainly constructive and it's helpful to the program.
Thank you. We have a question here about evaluation criteria, and one of the participants wants to know, the evaluation criteria for whether a former extremist has fully repented. And likewise, what are the preventive measures to take into account of, recurrence? So that's one. Another question is asking whether we know the rate of disengagement within this group. So to Mr. Nandi, direct question, is there any statistical evidence, the question goes, of the number of former fighters who disappear into society? Do we know how many? And also if we know whether they have successfully returned to normal life. So how many Boko Haram repentants have already left the Nigerian reintegration program? So do we know? And what influence could they have had on, or could they have on the other fighters? And finally, what happens where the victims are identified, as foreigners or non-Nigerian? Or even what happens when the fighters, are non-Nigerians? Then what do you do? So yeah, do you want, Nandi, do you want to go first?
Yes, as I said, the phenomenon of defectors leaving the group, but not reporting to the government program, just going their way, is completely opaque. We have no statistics at all in that regard, and I don't know of any organization that has. As I mentioned earlier, the members who go that way try to remain as discreet as possible, because if they disclose their identities and their trajectories, they would be arrested and returned to detention centers and viewed as potential, as spies or members of cells that are existing in different parts of the country. So they try as much as possible to distance themselves from the group and run a very discreet life. And it's difficult to know, have any statistical sense of, but we do know of, individuals in Kano, and sometimes in one or two cases in Lagos, in which people who have been members of the group had left the group and wanted to distance themselves from the group, but didn't pass through the government program.
One of the question is, you talked about the rates here of disengagement. You talked about the statistical evidence, very hard to do. What happens when the victim or the perpetrator is non-Nigerian?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the process by which those who are not Nigerians are also returned to their countries after the processing in the Operation Safe Corridor camp in Gombe State. The batch that was graduated in July last year, I remember, I think had 8 Cameroonians, 5 Chadians, and 1 Nigerian. And so after that process, they were returned to their own countries, and the countries would undertake their reintegration, which is, again, the point I made about Operation Safe Corridor being limited to de-radicalization and rehabilitation. The reintegration is undertaken by either state government in Nigeria or by the governments of those who come from other countries.
All right, thank you, Namdi. Martin?
Yeah, I thought I would pick up on the evaluation criteria. So I think there's 2 types of evaluation criteria. I understand your question to be, how do you know that individual is ready for reintegration and after rehabilitation process? And I think that's a really good question, because how do you measure such change is hugely difficult, and everybody is trying to improve it all the time. The matrix, if I can call it that the Somali government has, is that they have an exit board that sits together with different disciplines who sit on a regular basis and evaluate each individual, and they have scores around social skills, education goals, financial goals. So they look at how has the person behaved while he was at the center, how has he engaged with his colleagues, if he's been in fights and stuff like that, then they don't get approved until they improve their behavior. How he has related this with his families, what are the observations from the religious teachers, from the social workers, from the vocational trainers. Basically anyone who has engagement with that individual makes an assessment, and it's based on that evidence that they make the call whether he is fit for exit. And the time they spend in the center is individual. It's between 6 to 12 months. So it's not perfect. You're right, and you can't know 100% fully, but it's a set of multidisciplinary stakeholders, including senior security officials, who make that assessment against what they know about the individual's past, and then they consider whether the person can be clear for exit or not. Yeah, there was another thing about what was it? Another thing is that at least our program, but I think many programs, try to monitor the individuals after they leave the center. So for us, we do an interview after 3 months, and we do an interview after 12 months. And of course, for us, it's based on self-assessment. So the individual could choose to give us a picture that's looking more positive than reality, but we don't have resources to triangulate with family members and whatnot. But at least we try and assess, have they generated an income? How have they made family connections? Where are they? What are they doing? So there's attempts at least to try and get a sense of that. And in that way, at least after 12 months, when we then don't look at them anymore, there's still a positive trend in terms of them increasingly improving their integration into society.
Okay, very good. We have other questions here. This is for for Namdi, I mean, what informed the duration of that 24 weeks? Is it because of budget constraints, or is it the duration? Sorry, is research-based? Sorry. Another question is what reasons these defectors they give, you know, in returning to the group. In which region do you think these programs have been most successful, if there are any? Another question is one of the participants would like to know what place the weapons for food or weapons for cash program could occupy in the program of disengagement of the extremists. And he or she would also like to know whether the programs intended for extremists could not be perceived as bonuses to terrorists. So far as, you know, as communities do not have the opportunity to benefit from the various programs. I know you touched on this before. And a question on women. Are women also, you know, evaluated to determine involvement and or level of radicalization in the different programs? And a final question is again, goes back to those same question of what drives violent extremism, you know, poverty, unemployment, etc. So what measures have been put in place to ensure, you know, that those are tackled, to ensure that rehabilitation and reintegration work? So, you know, plethora of questions there. So Martin, if you want to start and answer whatever you think is fit.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can start a slightly different place. I think in order to have a comprehensive strategy to address the problem of violent extremism in any country, if they control territory, I'm not talking about in a place like, you know, in Somalia, for example, you need a military engagement, and then you need an opportunity to engage with those who are already in the group. And here, I think there's two strands, right? There's one for the low-level defectors where they are not suitable for a justice approach because they have done low-level crimes. Maybe you don't have enough evidence to prosecute them. And then there's a component of those that need to go through military courts in this case. And for the high-level defectors, there's a key question in particular in Somalia, because some of the very high-level guys, you might remember Robo, he left with his clan militia a couple of years ago and is now a politician. So there's a lot of questions around impunity and justice in these processes, and whether the amnesty also included high-level defectors who certainly have a lot of have done a lot of atrocities. Those I think we have to treat differently and find a way of dealing with the high level guys. So so you know, disengagement centers for low level defectors are not going to solve the whole problem of violent extremism in any one context. The state also have to improve its governance, its security, its service delivery, and of course in the way that they treat with the former violent extremists, they have to do that within the law in order to show that they practice what they preach, right? That they are able to deal with
the technical issue, Martin. So I think I'll go to Namdi, and then we can come back to you for concluding remarks if that works. Namdi.
Yeah, I think there was a question about the 24-week duration of the program. Whether it was a product of economic expediency or considered to be just adequate for rehabilitation and de-radicalization and so on. I'm not sure exactly how that was arrived at, but I do not think it's about resource constraints. There is considerable margin for scaling up the program, which the military would want to do as much as possible. So it's not probably resource constrained as such. As I mentioned also, it's enjoyed some support from international partners, so it's well supported. I think it's probably an expert's decision on the ideal duration of this transmission that we're trying to achieve with the defectors. As I said, some critics think it's too short for if you're trying to transform people and mindsets and ideology and so on, it's too short. But the argument is also that these are people who themselves are already, persuaded to transform, which is why they defected in the first place. So all you need is just to empower them and put them back on the road to reintegration, and that can be achieved within 24 weeks. There's the other question about why do they defect? Why do the defectors come out and join the government program? And we found a wide range of reasons. But first of all, as I mentioned earlier, some of the defectors were themselves not willing members of the group. They were conscripts, and some were, just grabbed as soon as Boko Haram overran their towns. They were forced into the group. So they were all the while looking for ways to come out. There were also some that are just disillusioned with the group. They don't see they couldn't see the alignment between the very glorious ideology that was sold to them before they got into the group and the very nasty reality that they find, within the group. And the leaders were not keeping pace with the preachments that they had made, earlier on. So some became disillusioned that this is all, in a sense, a scam, and they decided to leave. There were also some who left for reasons of safety. They had been in areas where the military had bombarded, considerably, and they had gotten to a point where they couldn't bear the violence anymore, and they started looking for, a way out. So there is a whole lot of reasons, but these are some of the very key reasons why the defectors are coming out. As I mentioned also, this is important that some of them came out on the assurance from the government, from the military, that they would not be harmed if they came out and submitted themselves. In other words, the main incentive for coming out for them was a guarantee of safety and that they would not be killed, and that encouraged them to come out.
Okay, and the question on women, are women also evaluated to determine involvement and or level of radicalization in the different programs? Can you speak to that?
Yes, in the Nigerian case, as I said, all captives and defectors are first of all taken to the military camp. There's a screening and profiling and a little bit of, some intelligence reports about them to clarify exactly what their status, is. Those who are seen to be core members and deeply embedded in the group are, of course, taken to detention centers and awaiting judicial process. Those who are seen as lower level members who are themselves not even persuaded about the group are then referred to the Operation Safe Corridor. But then the women and the children are then taken to the Bulunkutu center, as I said, run by the Borno state government. And it's more of a rehabilitation and reintegration preparation ground. Some of the women, largely victims, have suffered incredibly under Boko Haram, and they need a lot of help to, come back to a normal form, some of normalcy, both psychologically, and some have health problems, and some have children who are malnourished and facing very deep challenges. So they're taken to that center where the Ministry of Women Affairs and Social Development actually takes care of them and provides them with some rehabilitation.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Namdi. I don't know, Martine.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Sorry.
Sure.
Yeah, I took off the camera. Maybe that will help me. Yeah, on the women's question in Somalia, they are screened with a specific tool for women, but their situation is also assessed in a similar way. I think the approach for women is just a couple of years old, so the evidence is still building up around that. But yeah, they're certainly assessed. It's not the same tool, but they are also assessed and placed according to the threat that is associated with them.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much to our participants. And just to wrap up quickly, we have heard several important points. Some why people join, why they desert. So young people and adults join, Boko Haram or Shabab or other, frankly, terrorist groups for various reasons. And the crisis group research, the Institute for Security Studies research, RUSI, Martin's research, they all show that, some join willingly, obviously, inspired by the group's religious rhetoric or narrative on state neglect, and others for socioeconomic opportunities, and others were conscripted or abducted and held captive in Boko Haram or other strongholds. So there is a variety of reasons here that accounts for the diversity of these ex-Boko Haram associates. In terms of desertions, the motives that people leave include different things. There are individual circumstances, there are safety concerns, there's the group internal dynamics and fighting within the groups, obviously, among others. So as Nnamdi said nicely, and it was put in that report that I strongly recommend you read, when defectors, they leave these violent extremist factions, it's usually due to an increase of skepticism of the insurgency's prospects, their exposure to atrocious violence, as you heard, the danger posed to them and their families, aversion to the factions' unfair and brutal internal politics, the lack of material gain, etc., etc. And then the desire to escape a movement for some in which they were coerced into joining in the first place. That said, the fact that we are seeing thousands of individuals associated with the groups, leaving, that creates an opportunity for these countries like Chad Basin and others, to try to stabilize the region. But desertions need to be effectively managed here. As you heard today, there are a number of major problems with the way deserters are managed on their path to reintegration. In that crisis group report, and Nnamdi touched on it, there is still the uncertainty surrounding the fate of people who leave Boko Haram, and that obviously discourages others from making the same decision. Second is that communities are key to be involved in the reintegration process. Because they facilitate this engagement, as you heard from Martin and Nnamdi, they're the first point of contacts for these former extremists or ex-Boko Haram associates. So reconciliation depends on the community's approval and agreement. So it cannot be dictated here. So the program that Nnamdi described, and also that Martin mentioned in Somalia, needs to overcome, especially in the case of Nigeria, public hostility to it, opposition from politicians. Some characterize as a form of amnesty for killers, right? That these programs support terrorists, criminals that should be instead punished instead of being rewarded. So that needs to be addressed. The bottom line is that screening systems need to be fixed, detention conditions need to be improved, and finally, a point we didn't talk about, and that's probably should be another focus of another webinar, is that these government initiatives are aimed at disarmament, disengagement and reintegration, etc., nationally focused, even though the conflict obviously affects the whole region. So any successful approach needs to take account of the regional nature of the crisis, because Boko Haram or others, and then they recruit transnationally. So when members decide to leave, the process of disengagement also should take place across national boards. So probably there is a need for a regional strategy on demobilization, reintegration, and repatriation. So with that, I think this would bring an end to our webinar. It was really a delight to have Martin and Nnamdi, well-distinguished experts in their field. I certainly enjoy and learn a lot from reading your research. And it informs the field, and it informs this emerging field. So thank you very much, Martin. Thank you very much, Nnamdi. Thank you very much to the participants that have joined us.